What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to the Versus series. This is the series where I take two similar elements from a Call of Duty game, put them side by side, take a deep look at their stats to find out which one is better. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the two top dogs when it comes to assault rifles within Warzone, and this is the M4 versus the Grau. Now, statistically speaking, the M4 is actually more similar to the Ram 7, and the Grau is more similar to the Kilo 141. However, the two top assault rifles that are being used currently would be the M4 and the Grau, and this is why I wanted to compare these two together. So let's just start hopping into the stats here. When it comes to rate of fire, the M4 has a rate of fire of 833 rounds per minute, whereas the Grau is quite a bit slower at 750 rounds per minute. What this means is the M4 is going to be a little bit more forgiving. If you're missing shots, for instance, it's not going to be as punishing as if you're missing a shot with the Grau. As for damage, they're both pretty much exactly the same when it comes to damage profile, but our damage per second is a little bit faster with the M4 due to that higher fire rate at 389, whereas the DPS value for the Grau is 350. Keep in mind, this is within the maximum damage range. As for our time to kill, our base time to kill, assuming the enemy has no armor on whatsoever, with the M4 in the maximum damage range is 216 milliseconds, whereas with the Grau, it is a bit slower at 240 milliseconds. We see a similar story when the enemy has armor on, but this is actually exaggerated a little bit more. Our time to kill with 3 armor plates with the M4 is 576 milliseconds, whereas with the Grau, it's 640 milliseconds. So there's definitely a pretty noticeable difference when it comes to that. And up until this point, it looks like the M4 is clearly the better option. But there are several other factors we want to be taking into account when looking at these. The next one is our aim down sight time. This is quite important. How fast can you actually get aim down sight and on target? With the M4, our base aim down sight time is 250 milliseconds, whereas the Grau is a little bit faster at 234 milliseconds. So that can actually help you a little bit in making up for that time to kill difference, at least in situations where you're not already aiming down sight at your enemy. As for our movement speed, the Grau is a little bit faster than the M4 at 96.5% movement speed. And this is really nice within Warzone as well, because you often have a lot of distance to cover, and movement speed can make a big difference here. And finally in this category, I wanted to have a look at the reload time, which I just wanted to point out that they're pretty much the same when it comes to reload time. Technically speaking, the Grau reloads a little bit faster than the M4, but they are very similar in this area. Now, the next really important thing to cover, and this is where the Grau starts to gain a bit of an edge against the M4, is the range values. As you can see here, our 4-shot kill range, assuming the enemy has no armor, is pretty similar with these, but the Grau definitely has a slight edge over the M4 here. It's more so our 5-shot kill range. This is where the Grau really pulls ahead quite strong compared to the M4. And this means in some of those longer range fights, even though you're shooting faster with the M4, you're going to be able to deal more damage out to a greater range with the Grau, which will then give the Grau a time to kill advantage in those ranges. Additionally, within Warzone, you are typically going to be using a longer barrel on these guns, or at least the good players will tend to lean towards the longer barrels. So I wanted to show these barrels and how they affect the ranges with these guns. And as you can see, we have the Corvus and the Grenadier barrel for the M4. And with these, we get a little bit of a boost. We're looking at a 30% boost with the Corvus barrel and a 40% boost with the Grenadier barrel. And then with the Grau, we have the Nexus and the Archangel, and these ones will give a 40 to 45% boost to your ranges. And especially when you're looking at the 5-shot kill range in blue there, you can see that this is where the Grau just completely blows the M4 out of the water at longer ranges. So clearly, barrels can have a really massive effect on the performance of these guns within Warzone. And therefore, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into these two different styles of barrel, where we have the slightly longer barrel and then the longest version of the barrel for each of these guns. And let's have a look at the stats for the Corvus and the Nexus barrels. For the Corvus barrel, like I said, you get a 30% boost to your range, whereas the Nexus gives you a 40% boost. Also, when using these two barrels, we get equal aim down sight times now. So the Nexus actually has a slightly worse effect on your aim down sight time, but since the base aim down sight time is better with the Grau, it all equalizes at this point. And also, they have the same impact on our movement speed. As for the longest version of these barrels, which are the more common ones that I see a lot of top streamers and pro players using within Warzone, the Grenadier gives us a 40% boost to our range, whereas the Archangel is a 45% boost. Then when we have a look at aim down sight time, we actually get a slightly slower aim down sight time with the Archangel compared to the Grenadier barrel on the M4. However, we don't lose as much of our movement speed with the Archangel barrel because the Grenadier gives us a 4% loss to our movement speed, whereas the Archangel is about a 3.5% loss to our movement speed. Now, moving on to the next really important stat with these guns, especially in Warzone, is how accurate are they? What kind of recoil patterns do they have? And I just decided I'd put it side by side here. The first plot in green, that's without any attachments. Then you can see that I've done plots with the different barrel types as well. And the main thing to point out here is they've got a pretty similar magnitude of recoil. Like, they kick upwards the same amount for the most part between the M4 and the Grau. However, with the M4, we get a little bit more side-to-side bounce with our shots, and then it also tends to veer to the right a lot stronger than the Grau will. With the Grau's recoil, it's pretty much straight upwards. It does veer a little bit left and then correct itself as it goes upwards. And also there's very little side-to-side bounce. So if I had to choose between these two, of course they are both very accurate guns. However, I do find it to be a little bit easier to control the recoil with the Grau compared to the M4. Now, just to take this one step further, I wanted to look at the recoil properties with some common attachment combinations that you would use in Warzone, because we're not using guns without attachments. We are going to stack up on attachments. So what I did is I created basically the same build for both of these guns, and this is a build that I could totally see myself using within Warzone. It's actually pretty much exactly the same as the build I will use with the Grau. However, I didn't put the 60-round mag on that I would normally use, just because then the recoil plots get kind of ridiculous because there's a lot of rounds per plot. So with this, I'm using the longest possible barrel. So on the M4, I'm using the Grenadier barrel, and on the Grau, I'm using the Archangel barrel. Then I'm using a monolithic suppressor, a tac laser, and the Commando foregrip, and this is the result with our recoil properties. Once again, we get a really similar magnitude to our recoil, but the Grau doesn't have as much side-to-side bounce. It kicks almost straight upwards. It does veer a little to the left at the beginning. But once again, I would just say it's much easier to handle this recoil with the Grau, although both of them are extremely accurate. Now, one last thing I wanted to factor in here while using these longest barrels is, what do the iron sights look like? Because if you have a really good iron sight, you don't even necessarily need to use an optic, and therefore you can use that attachment slot on something more important, like something that helps with your recoil control or your aim down sight time. With the Grenadier barrel, we've got a fairly thick front sight, and this can sometimes be obstructive in those really long range situations. Sometimes it'll kind of cover your target up. Keep in mind with this, I'm also using the XRK blueprint, which gives us that big ring on the rear sight. I do prefer it like that compared to the base version of the M4 with the Grenadier barrel. However, when we compare that to the iron sight on the Archangel barrel, you can see this iron sight is incredibly clean, very minimalistic, and I find it's excellent for tracking those targets at really long ranges because you just don't lose your target behind that front sight ever. And this, I would say, is actually a pretty big benefit to be using the Archangel barrel on the Grau compared to the Grenadier barrel on the M4. So those are all of the primary stats that I wanted to look at when comparing these two assault rifles. And I think most people would agree here that you don't have one that is universally better than the other. In my opinion, based on my experience as well as these stats, the M4 is slightly better than the Grau in the more closer range engagements, whereas the Grau starts to gain an edge after about 40 meters or so when you're looking at the range values as well as the recoil when using the longest barrel. Having said that though, I'm not saying the Grau is horrible up close and the M4 is horrible at long range. Both of these guns are incredibly versatile, and you can use them at pretty much any range within Warzone, and it's one of the reasons they're just so popular to be using. But yeah, the way I see it, I would rather use the M4 if I'm planning on fighting, more so in the slightly closer range situations, whereas with the Grau, I definitely prefer it for extremely long ranges. And this also impacts how I build my class setups as well. With the M4, I'm often going to be using that overkill with a sniper rifle. So then I can be really dominant in those closer to mid-range gunfights with the M4, and then at the extremely long ranges, I can swap over to a sniper and pick those people off. Whereas with the Grau, I actually like using the Grau essentially as my sniper rifle, where I'll challenge people at surprisingly long ranges. However, I don't feel as confident pushing a building with the Grau, and therefore I like to run it overkilled with an SMG, like an MP5 or an MP7. Of course, you could absolutely do the same with the M4 as well, because the M4 isn't going to be as good as the SMGs, for instance, up close. But it's not as needed, in my opinion, compared to the Grau. So that's pretty much it for this versus video. I wouldn't say there is a clear winner between these two. It kind of depends on your preferences, as well as the ranges that you're planning on using these guns within. But a great rule of thumb is up close, the M4 is a little bit better, and at longer ranges, the Grau is a little bit better. And with that, I'd like to know in the comments section below, what is your opinion on these two guns? Which one do you prefer, the M4 or the Grau? Also, if you guys are interested in hearing about the best sniper rifle to use within Warzone, I have done a video on that comparing the AX50 with the HDR, and I will leave that link down below. And of course, I am open to any suggestions for a future Versus episode when it comes to Warzone. Are there any other guns or pieces of equipment that you'd like me to compare and put side by side to see which one is better? Just let me know those thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.